Ladies and gentlemen, I call this hearing of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order. I'm pleased to welcome everyone here today for this very important hearing on the counterterrorism strategy against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, also known in the region as Daesh. ISIL or Daesh continues to spread and create instability throughout the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Asia. Their propaganda and insidious campaign of influence extends globally, manipulating and recruiting young women who are willing to die for Daesh. The trajectory we are on is not promising. The President himself has acknowledged that we do not have a complete strategy to combat the threat. Defense Secretary Carter has acknowledged that the military is reviewing how to increase the effectiveness of our campaign and that an additional 450 troops would deploy to Iraq to expand the Advise and Assist mission. When I last visited Iraq in February of this year, along with Representative Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, Elise Stefanik of New York, and Brad Ashford of Nebraska, there was talk that the Iraqi army would begin taking back Mosul by the summer, which now is leaving nearly 1 million people subjugated. Today, sadly, we see this is not the case. While often characterized as a terrorist organization, ISIL-Daesh fights and behaves like an army. They remain well-funded and resourced, and we saw recently in Ramadi that they do not necessarily need overwhelming numbers to win on the battlefield, only an ability to strike fear in the hearts of those they encounter. Today, we will seek answer to very simple but serious issues of national importance. First, are we on the right path to defeat ISIL-Daesh? Second, what problems exist with our current counterterrorism strategy? And lastly, what other actions could be taken to counter this evolving national security threat? We will not answer all the questions today, but what will be certain is the fact that it will take years to render ISIL-Daesh ineffective. Because of that, we cannot ignore the pressure of the declining defense budgets and the looming shadow of defense sequestration. As we examine our strategy against ISIL-Daesh, we must remind ourselves that if the defense sequestration continues, we will truly be fighting this threat with one hand tied behind our back. We are fortunate today to have before us a panel of expert witnesses. They are Ms. Linda Robinson, a senior international policy analyst with the RAND Corporation, Mr. Michael Eisenstadt, the director of the Military and Securities Studies Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Dr. Fred Kagan, the director of the Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute, and Mr. Brian Fishman, a counterterrorism research fellow with the International Studies Program at the New America Foundation. I'd like now to turn to my friend, the ranking member from Rhode Island, Mr. Jim Langevin, for any comments he'd like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for providing us the benefit of your experience and your insight. I know what you're going to have to say is going to be invaluable to the committee, and I look forward to today's discussion, certainly. As we all know, we find ourselves in a very difficult circumstance when it comes to the interests of the United States and our allies and partners in the Middle East in the fight against ISIL. Our interests and objectives, and those of our partners, are not necessarily aligned. The ambitious U.S. strategy does not appear to be able to achieve the end state, but we're dealing with a serious enemy. And recent ISIL gains in Iraq and Syria demonstrate the need for a comprehensive, cohesive, whole-of-government U.S. strategy, as well as the cooperation of regional partners, which has been challenged at best to enlist more support from our regional partners. Now, while I share the frustrations of many about the seeming lack of a visible strategy, I'm not unsympathetic regarding the immense complexity of interlinked and sometimes contradictory challenges that the administration faces. We face a morass of gray when it comes to our menu of options. A ground commitment to the region seems to be a win the battle, lose the war option, but we also simply cannot walk away. Similarly, swatting bad guys without a larger strategy in place really threatens to be another recruiting tool for our adversaries. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what they think an effective U.S. strategy to counter ISIL should look like, and the situation fueling it across Iraq and Syria should encompass to achieve both near-term and long-term success. Now, specifically, I'd like to know what concrete actions you would recommend, what countervailing forces prevent these actions from being taken, and can those forces be mitigated? Are existing policies counterproductive? Can we have a coherent Syria and Iraq policy while negotiations with Iran are ongoing? What should post-war Syria look like? Are we able to align our objectives with those of our allies? And how do we engage more nations in the region to be more proactive and involved in this strategy? Are we able to align our objectives, again, with those of our allies? And how do we regain the initiative to make ISIL reactive rather than proactive? And how do we fight their narrative? What assumptions and desires will we have to jettison in order to achieve a workable outcome? And are we sufficiently leveraging the power of the non-military means, including financial, at our disposal? So we've heard a variety of answers to these questions from the administration already, in testimony and otherwise, but I hope we can expand on our thinking here today. I am under no illusions that if we only change a few things about the United States' approach to the region, peace will somehow suddenly break out tomorrow. We must recognize that we are in a highly complex generational struggle against those who would pervert one of the world's great religions into a justification for the murder of thousands of innocents, including women and children, and the wanton destruction of an incredible piece of our shared human heritage in a region already gripped by a terrible humanitarian crisis born from years of strife and conflict. But with today's discussion, I hope we can explore what a more peaceful region would look like and require, and ensure that our actions today and tomorrow are aligned in working towards a sustainable solution. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing and the witnesses that you've arranged to testify today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lanchevin, and I agree with you that we're in a generational conflict, and I look forward to working with you in a bipartisan manner on these issues. We're joined today at some time with Representative Martha McSally of Arizona and Representative Mike Kaufman of Colorado, who is here. They are members of the House Armed Services Committee, but not part of the subcommittee. So I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all subcommittee members have had the opportunity to ask questions. Is there any objection? Without objection, non-subcommittee members will be recognized at the appropriate time, with each member here under the 5-minute constraint. Ms. Robinson, thank you again for being here today, and we look forward, beginning with your testimony, and for the benefit of persons who are attending today, and I'm just grateful to see the number of people who are interested. It's a 5-minute section for each one of you. Then each member of the subcommittee will have the opportunity for 5 minutes, and all of us are going to be a person beyond any characterization of inappropriate, and that is Pete Villano is going to keep the time. So as professional staff of the Armed Services Committee, so we're very fortunate to have such a capable person. Ms. Robinson.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, and members. Thank you for inviting me to speak on these important topics. I returned from Iraq 3 weeks ago, from 10 days in Iraq and Jordan. This was my second research trip to the region this year. I will first address the military line of operations, then recommendations for improving the strategy that is currently in place, and finally comment on the alternatives. My bottom line, the best option is the partnered approach because indigenous ground forces are required to defeat this formidable hybrid enemy in a lasting way. However, the ways and means currently applied are inadequate on both the U.S. and the Iraqi side. Syria is a much harder case, but there the Alliance of the People's Protection Units and Free Syria Army may have potential. My prepared remarks include a detailed assessment of the 5 forces fighting ISIL in Iraq. I conclude that separately they cannot defeat ISIL, but together they might. Currently, however, they are stovepiped and inadequately coordinated and supported. The following suite of measures, if implemented quickly and in tandem, might achieve significant effect in the short term. U.S. advisors should be pushed out to all area commands in ISIL-threatened territory. They should also be allowed to embed with capable and trusted brigades, such as the Counterterrorism Service, and to move forward as needed to their command posts. Sending 450 advisors to Anbar was a first step, but belated. It had been urged months ago. Advisors cannot be effective if pushed out on the eve of battle. It takes time to gain enemy and friendly situational awareness, plan and conduct operations, conduct tribal engagement, coordinate artillery and air support, and gain influence to restrain abuses. My second recommendation is that U.S. Special Operations Forces have their request granted immediately. They have requested Excelis satellite radios that are in U.S. Army stocks in Kuwait, and they want to give these to Iraqi units. These radios instantly and accurately mark the unit's location, and together with U.S. Joint Terminal Air Controllers at the brigade and area commands, this could have a transformative effect. The people I talked to in Iraq, however, did not argue for putting the Joint Terminal Air Controllers at the battalion and below level. One reason is that this would entail a much larger footprint for quick reaction forces, medevac, air support, and logistic support, and the certainty of U.S. troops being in contact with the enemy. Many SOF officers also have come to believe that this ultimately increases dependency. My third recommendation is that the Baghdad Combined Operations Center, the current nerve center of our effort in Baghdad, needs to focus more on coordination and planning at the national level rather than act primarily as a strike cell. My fourth recommendation is that the needed vehicles and heavy weapons be expedited to Iraq. The depots are full of small arms and ammunition. And in particular, I would urge that the Iraqi Counterterrorism Service needs be met immediately. They have been carrying the load of the fighting. As some of you may know, they've been heavily attrited with over 2,600 casualties, although they are now in the process of rebuilding. They will reach their assigned level of 11,000 by next January. Finally, the air campaign could be made more effective within the current ROE by certain measures, including increased ISR, more deliberate targeting, and additional target engagement authorities. For Iraq's part, it must incorporate more Sunnis into both the Popular Mobilization Forces and the Army. Thousands of Sunnis want to fight. I met with a number of Tikritis who fought spontaneously to liberate Tikrit, but they now have no support. Passage of the National Guard legislation would be extremely helpful if it gives provincial governors a role. This would also regularize command and control of local Shia and Sunni forces for the long term. Third, Iraq must commit to recruiting those forces or others into the Iraqi army, put good leaders into key posts, and shift the current disposition, which is heavily arrayed around Baghdad and in Shia areas. In return, I believe the U.S. should support a long-term rebuilding of the ISF, the Iraqi security forces, because the alternative is Lebanonization, the entrenchment of militias. Iraq may dissolve or it may find its way to a decentralized state. But taking actions that hasten that dissolution, such as unilaterally creating a large army of tribal forces, could fuel further conflict. We've been down that road. The partnered approach may not work. We may be forced to fall back to containment, though I believe that may be no more effective. I would not give up on the current partnered approach without aggressively implementing it and staying that course for some time. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ms. Robinson, very much. Mr. Eisenstadt.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me this opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the counter-ISIL campaign. Recent gains by ISIL in Iraq and Syria mark major setbacks in the 10-month-old campaign against the group and highlight fundamental flaws in the administration's strategy that need to be rectified if the coalition is to succeed. To ensure success in what will inevitably be a long struggle, the U.S. needs to, first, address the means-ends mismatch in its strategy, second, bring its own policies and those of its allies into alignment with the strategy, and third, undermine the appeal of ISIL by ensuring the defeat of its military forces and the dismantling of its state. Now, first, with regards to the means-ends mismatch. The U.S. has devoted inadequate resources in pursuit of what is, for now, an unrealistic goal, destroying ISIL. The U.S. needs to ramp up its efforts while lowering its sights, at least in the near term, regarding an organization that has demonstrated impressive regenerative powers. Its resilience is rooted in ideological and organizational factors and the characteristics of the Middle Eastern operational environment. Ideologically, ISIL supporters are unbothered by the criticism of establishment Muslim clerics, whom they regard as servants of an illegitimate state system. Thus, efforts to delegitimize ISIL on religious grounds are likely to succeed only on the margins. Organizationally, ISIL can draw on manpower reserves from around the world, and it has recently started establishing overseas affiliates, ensuring the survival of the ISIL brand, even if its flagship operation in Iraq and Syria is defeated. As for the operational environment, the proliferation of weak and failing states and the region's zero-sum politics ensure the survival of groups like ISIL. Thus, while coalition military operations may be attriting and in places rolling back ISIL forces, the coalition has not degraded the overall capabilities of an organization that remains on the offensive in a number of critical fronts. In terms of aligning policies and strategy, the United States and its partners have often pursued policies that have strengthened Salafi jihadist groups such as ISIL, thereby undermining the U.S.-led campaign. First of all, American inaction in the face of the Syrian civil war, the Maliki regime's sectarian politics in Iraq, the widespread perception in the region that the United States is tacitly aligned with Iran, and the fact that America's first military strikes in Iraq were to save Yazidis, Turkmen, and Kurds, anybody but Sunni Arabs. All of these were a recruiting boon for Salafi jihadist groups such as ISIL. The United States insists that it is, secondly, the United States insists that it is training and equipping the moderate Syrian opposition to fight ISIL, while the opposition, as well as America's partners to this effort, want to fight the Assad regime. And this is a recipe for disaster. Third, the success of America's counter-ISIL strategy is hostage to its regional partners, whose politics created the conditions for the rise of violent jihadist groups such as ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra. Fourth, the United States will not succeed in its fight against ISIL in Iraq if it does not succeed in its fight against ISIL in Syria, where it enjoys a safe haven that it will use to threaten and undermine the state of Iraq. But it's not too late to correct course. So what is to be done? The solution is not another major U.S. ground operation that, absent changes in the region's politics, would likely have to be repeated several years hence. But neither can we afford to walk away from the problem. The answer is rebalancing the administration's light footprint approach. Thus, the U.S. should close the means-ends gap by ramping up its advise and assist mission in Iraq and its train and equip effort in Syria, rethinking its approach to training Iraqis and Syrians, intensifying its air campaign, and preventing additional reverses as recently occurred in Ramadi and Palmyra. New victories for ISIL, even if ephemeral, will be fatal to the effort to convince Sunni Arabs sitting on the fence in Iraq to join the coalition against ISIL. The goal should be to overextend ISIL by pressuring it simultaneously in Iraq and Syria, thereby rendering it vulnerable to internal uprisings and external attack. However, closing the means-ends gap is not sufficient for success. The United States also needs to alter its policies and those of its partners that have undermined the military effort. The dependence of the U.S. strategy on its allies' willingness to alter their politics and policies is our strategy's Achilles heel. And finally, with regard to undermining ISIL's appeal, because so much of ISIL's appeal derives from its aura of military invincibility, its defeat would show that ISIL was just another failed ideological movement that brought only ruin to its supporters. Its defeat would mean no caliphate, no Islamic utopia, no glory and adventure, and none of the other things that have drawn so many to embrace it. The defeat of ISIL is thus key to undermining its appeal, discrediting its ideology, and demolishing its brand. And this, ultimately, is the most important goal of the counter-ISIL military campaign. But the administration's current light footprint approach permits ISIL to continue to accrue victories that undercut this effort. Now, one final thought. The U.S. and its partners need to figure out how al-Qaeda and its affiliates, as well as Iran, fit into all of this. For if the coalition enfeebles or defeats ISIL, which is still a long way away, only to clear the way for the primacy of Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and the expansion of Iranian regional influence, the United States will have only succeeded in further fueling the region's raging sectarian and geopolitical conflicts. The sooner Washington realizes this, the sooner it can work to avert an even greater disaster that it may be inadvertently abetting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eisenstadt and Dr. Fred Kagan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for calling this hearing, and thank you to all of the members for attending and for giving this important issue your thought when there are so many other things going on. I agree with the ranking member. This is very hard, and I also have a lot of sympathy with anyone, including the administration, struggling to come up with a strategy to deal with this problem. And I do think there's a lot of room for reasonable people to disagree. I have offered in my testimony a fair amount of detail about what I think should be done in Iraq and what we might hope to achieve. I'd like, for the few minutes that I have here, to address what I think is a conceptual problem in the way that we've been discussing this matter, or one of several. And that is the continued refrain that there is no military solution to this problem. Of course, there's no military solution to this problem. War is an extension of politics. There is never a purely military solution, or almost never, to a military conflict. However, this is a war, and any solution has to have a military component. And I think that we are too often conflating these two issues and not paying enough heed to what is required of the military component of any strategy that might be successful, while telling ourselves that there's not a military solution, and I'm not offering a military solution. But I think that we are generally underestimating what is required of the military component of any strategy. And although I would associate myself with almost everything that my previous two colleagues have said, I disagree with the notion that a larger footprint would create dependency or would be unwise, and I very much disagree with the notion that it's desirable to keep U.S. forces from engaging in combat with the enemy if our objective is to defeat this enemy and maintain and establish a solid alliance with Iraqis. It's extraordinarily hard to establish your bona fides as an ally if your position is, hey, we're going to watch you guys go out and fight, let us know how that goes. And at the end of the day, we really need to think hard about this. Are we in this or not? Is this our war or isn't it? If it is, then we need to be prepared to have our people serve alongside of Iraqis, not as they did in 2007, 8, 9. I'm not advocating putting combat brigades in and taking the fight away from Iraqis. I entirely agree that partnership is the correct model. I think we probably need to partner down to lower levels, but that's something that I would be reasonably comfortable leaving up to commanders in the field if they were given the discretion to make those calls. I think that having a black and white national level decision that says we're not going to do that, I think it's the wrong decision, and I think it handicaps our forces too much. I also think that we have a problem when we say there's no military solution, what's the political solution, in that we break in our minds what is in fact a real close relationship between those two things on the ground. The political situation in Iraq isn't just whatever the political situation in Iraq is. It is affected by what we do. It is affected by the military situation. It is affected by the actions we take. It is affected by what we actually offer. We don't like the fact that the Iraqis are too dependent on Iran. I don't like that. I understand why they are. We are not offering them enough to make it a reasonable bet to turn down what the Iranians are offering them and anger the Iranians to some extent and rely instead on us. Now, it may be that they wouldn't anyway, and it may be that we can't offer them enough, and so on and so on. But as Linda Robinson said very eloquently, we have continually failed to try to do a number of things where there was a reasonable expectation that they might succeed, and as long as we continue to fail to try to do things that have worked before in admittedly different circumstances, we're going to continue to chase this. And so I think we need to understand that we need to see the military component of any solution as an element of the larger solution that interacts with the entire solution, and understand that we have the potential to change the situation in ways that can also change the political discourse. And lastly, I would like to just make a brief comment on the subject of minimalism and the belief that we really should send in only as many forces, precisely try to titrate exactly how many forces we need on the ground and not have a single soldier there more than is necessary, which is, I recognize, not what my colleagues are advocating. It is a mistake to take that approach. Unexpected things happen. Ramadi comes under attack. Ramadi falls. You have setbacks in war. The truth of the matter is that if you do believe this is a war, and if you do believe that we are in it, then you should also have to believe that we need to make available the forces that are required and forces that might be required in dire circumstances should they arise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kagan. Mr. Fishman.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, members of the committee. Thank you for having me here. The Islamic State is a hybrid organization. It aims to establish an extremely harsh form of Islamic law across much of the world. And to advance that goal, it has 5 essential lines of effort. It's establishing a proto-state at the moment in Iraq and Syria. It's waging military campaigns to advance that in those 2 places. It's encouraging followers to independently attack hostile governments in the West, in the U.S. and Western Europe. It's building a network of affiliates, working to establish similar governance structures around the world. And critically, as Michael Eisenstadt said, it's inspiring jihadis around the world to enter this organization or at least endorse its vision of a caliphate. We have to fight against all of these lines of effort if we are going to succeed against this organization. Critically, ISIS's fundamental goal and its basic operational vectors, with the exception of building an affiliate network and expanding its core operations to Syria, have been relatively consistent since October of 2006. And in Washington, we continue to fail to recognize the persistence of this organization, going back to the declaration of what was then called the Islamic State of Iraq. We don't often recognize our long history fighting ISIS, but we have effectively been fighting this organization for a decade already. And it is because of our sustained fight to this date that I unfortunately believe that our fight in the future is going to take at least another decade. And we need to be thinking about whatever policy we pursue, it needs to be sustainable. It needs to be something that doesn't just stop. The worst mistakes we can make are to make a commitment and then pull away. From 2006 to 2008, we fought ISIS effectively, but we failed to destroy it. The surge of 150,000 American troops into Iraq, or as a top-line number, including crucial special operators, and a concerted effort to inspire the awakening of Sunni tribes against the Islamic State of Iraq, eliminated its ability to control territory and forced it to abandon large-scale insurgent and conventional military operations. Nonetheless, the group was not defeated. It remained one of the deadliest terrorist organizations in the world. It was continually, from that period forward, viewed by jihadis globally as the kernel of a future caliphate. It maintained a strong presence near Mosul, Iraq throughout the period and in Syrian border areas. It established the bureaucratic structure for future governance, and it sustained the ability to play spoiler in Iraqi politics by assassinating Sunnis and using terrorist attacks to encourage the Shia-dominated Maliki government into embracing its sectarian demons. There are some key lessons from that era that we should remember today as we think about our future strategy. One is that ISIS is vulnerable to military pressure. Despite its growth, the group's conventional military power is limited, and it can be disrupted with military power. Second is ISIS is extremely resilient. It can shift its geographic base of operations and mode of organization relatively quickly. Operational setbacks will impact ISIS's global appeal, but the group will remain a viable caliphate to its supporters so long as it controls territory and continues to fight. And that means really any territory. It was continually viewed as a future caliphate, even in 2009 and 2010 and 2011 at its weakest moment. And even a diminished ISIS can operate as a political spoiler in Iraq and Syria. So what should we do in the future? ISIS will not be defeated so long as the Syrian civil war continues and Sunnis in Iraq live in mortal fear of their own government. Military action can contain ISIS and limit its ability to control territory and people, but such gains will be inadequate and fleeting without political resolutions in Syria and Iraq. The ugly reality is the United States does not have policy levers to defeat the Islamic State in the near term without massive, and in my opinion, politically untenable intervention in both Iraq and Syria. This is going to be a long fight, and our strategy has to be calibrated such that it is sustainable. So rather than scope an entire strategy, I'm going to just point to a couple of present issues. One, should the United States support Syrian rebels focused on deposing Assad, in addition to those focused on destroying ISIS? The answer is yes. And this is something that I have not believed continually, but I've come to this opinion. Although this approach carries significant risks such as increased Iranian troublemaking and weapons falling into jihadi hands, it will bolster relationships with our allies in the region, including and especially Turkey, and increase pressure on the Assad regime to accept political compromise. That said, we should not, under any circumstances, legitimize al-Qaeda-linked jihadi groups like Jabhat al-Nusra. Should the United States continue to funnel weapons through Baghdad to Kurdish and Sunni factions as opposed to arming them separately? I think yes for now. We have to reinforce governance where it exists, and the governance where it exists today still is centered in Baghdad. Should the United States increase the number of U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq, and this is where I disagree with my colleague Fred, moderately increasing the number of troops may improve our operational outcomes, but it will not lead to the destruction of ISIS. We put 150,000 Americans on the ground before. We're talking about a tenth of that now, and I don't believe that this is going to have a decisive outcome because I don't believe that it is sustainable. A mini surge can push ISIS into a box, but a smaller box, but it will still have a box, and having that box is what matters. Our decade of war against ISIS has not produced a decisive outcome, in large measure because our strategy and commitment has been inconsistent. To be successful in the next decade, we must have a clear, consistent, and sustainable strategy. The only good news is that jihadi organizations have a long track record of self-destruction, and ISIS is laying the seeds of insurgency against it as we speak, with its attacks on Sunnis, its fighting against other Syrian rebel groups. Over time, they will collapse, but in order to produce that, we need to have a sustainable strategy rather than an intermittent one that reduces our credibility further in the region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fishman. And thank each of you. And Mr. Eisenstadt, you referenced it, and for each person, I'd be interested in your response, beginning with Ms. Robinson, about ISIL-Daesh being successful in building a global propaganda campaign to recruit foreign supporters from around the world, reinforcing its battlefield successes and creating an aura of military invincibility. Why has this global campaign been so effective, appealing to such a broad target audience worldwide? And what approaches should the Pentagon consider to counteract this campaign and reduce the appeal of potential recruits and supporters who can be trained overseas to return home and attack American families? Ms. Robinson.
Chairman Wilson, thank you. The brand of ISIL, I think, is so potent because they have been so enormously successful on the battlefield. They are tactically proficient and far more formidable than what U.S. forces faced when we were there. It's just an order of magnitude different. They're very adept at shifting between maneuver and guerrilla warfare, launching new and diversionary attacks, evolving new tactics, and as you note, they trumpet their successes globally, which has drawn new recruits and affiliates. So that engine, I wish I could agree with Brian, but I think that it doesn't, as I see it, contain the seeds of its own demise. It's going to have to be stopped. And the information warfare, I think, has to be conducted with Muslim voices, indigenous and worldwide. I just do not see the U.S. being effective in the lead. Now, General Terry, who is the Combined Joint Task Force commander, had been trying for months to get an Arab spokesman for that coalition. I think that is one of those unfortunate things. You wonder why aren't people stepping up. There is now, I think, the co-lead by UAE for the counter-messaging bin of activities. But I think that the actual content of the message needs to be looked at. And to me, there is no more effective message than one delivered by an disaffected former ISIL fighter. And I think we have got to get those voices and those of the families of the ISIL fighters who have died and what they've been lost to this way of life. And I just think we're far less adept at energizing that kind of messaging. Although I would like to note the incoming two-star in Baghdad, General Richard Clark, is very key. He is honed in on the media and information aspect of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with what Ms. Robinson said, and I would just kind of reinforce the point that nothing succeeds like success, and that is a major factor for their appeal. And conversely, I think the most important way to discredit the appeal of their ideology is by military defeat. As Brian said also, you know, if they're not holding terrain, if there is no caliphate, there is no Islamic utopia, it's a lot less appealing as an idea. I would also, you know, mention, and this is a topic which I'm actually starting to do a lot of thought about, so I don't have a comprehensive, you know, answer to you, but it seems to me that a lot of, at least in the public, a lot of the government's, the administration's emphasis has been on countering their religious ideology and trying to get Muslim voices to discredit it. And as I pointed out in my, you know, remarks, by and large, most supporters of ISIS don't really care what mainstream clerics think about them. They have their own clerics, and they believe that all these other mainstream clerics are part of the problem. So I think I get the sense that perhaps we're pushing, you know, on a locked door. That's not the way to go. By, you know, we can affect things around the edges by trying to counter their ideology and trying to discredit it, but I'm not sure that's the right way to go. In addition, we have to recognize that in this fight, the government is not the most flexible and effective actor. And what we need is to partner with the private sector, and we need a troll army of people online who we could provide information to, what the, you know, Countering Terrorism Center at West Point used to do of publishing captured documents which provide insights into how ISIS functions and the way of how it is to live under ISIS control. So that millions of people online who are Muslims and who object to their message can use the information to fight them. And then the final point I would just say, we also need a counter-narrative, because you can't fight something with nothing. And people are flocking to ISIS because it fulfills a role in terms of their identity, in terms of providing them with meaning in life, and we need to be able to provide, or our allies probably more to the point, need to be able to provide a counter-narrative which maybe speaks about inclusiveness and tolerance and the like. Again, these are half-formed ideas, but I think this gives us some vectors for, you know, how to think about this. And
Thank you very much, Dr. Kagan.
I'll be very brief. We don't have a narrative problem. We have a reality problem. And we can talk narrative from hell to breakfast, but the reality is that we're losing and they're winning. And as long as that's the case, there's no narrative that's going to affect the situation very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fishman.
I agree very much with that. It's not we talk too much about their proficiency with social media. The issue is that their message right now is one of victory, and that's one that people can get behind. The one thing that I would say about what is a credible voice, I agree very much with what Linda said about former fighters. One of the distinguishing factors at an ideological level of ISIS from al-Qaeda is that for them, authority, ideological and messaging authority, comes from your proximity to a fight, to being in battle. Where al-Qaeda used to point to scholars that would sit around and write things. Those of us in think tanks might like that. But, you know, but for ISIS, the only thing that gives you ideological authority is being on the battlefield. And so if you're going to push back on them at an ideological level, it's going to have to come from somebody with experience in the fight.
Well, thank you very much, and I share your concerns that we need to have Dr. Kagan an example of success. But at the same time, I'm grateful that the House did pass in the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act authority for the Department to carry out a pilot program to counteract the propaganda campaigns, and I appreciate the concept of a former ISIL supporter and or family members of deceased ISIL supporters that to carry out campaign to counteract propaganda. And this provision we hope to be carrying through conference so the Pentagon has the ability to counter Daesh. It's my view that in a bipartisan manner here that we understand the threat of jihadists who proclaim death to America, death to Israel. And I now proceed to Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think I have a question that any of the panelists here can answer. And I know we've talked before about how ISIL is very in tune to what's going on here culturally, you know, from the media, particularly social media. And they also have, I'm sure, have seen news reports on the question about what to do about ISIL. What do you think that the ISIL leadership is thinking as far as their biggest fear is concerned? Do you think it's, you know, more airstrikes from America, that we would eventually put troops on the ground, that we would arm factions within their so-called caliphate? What is the thing that makes ISIL fear the most?
I think that it's been very clear that the thing they fear the most is what happened to them that defeated them before, which is the awakening. And they most fear that the populations that they live amongst will turn against them and will be supported against them. And I think they fear to some extent that we will assist that, but they have been carrying out a ruthless campaign of assassinations, as Brian pointed out, for many, many years now, precisely to forestall that option, because I think that is the one that they regard as most permanently damaging and threatening to them.
In regards to that, you know, when they come into an area and they want to set up this caliphate, they want to do it obviously with Sunni Muslims. With so many Sunni Muslims being very distrustful of Shia Muslims, particularly in Iraq, how do you build the support for the people that they are in control? If you were to try to form some sort of a coalition or arm them or what have you, how can you, with that Sunni versus Shia element going on there, how can you make something like that real and sustainable?
Congressman, I think you really put your finger on what is in many respects the most important issue here, which is that we have, as Brian and my other colleagues have said, we have a sectarian war throughout the region, and it's actually going global. And that sectarian war is, in my opinion, the largest, most powerful long-term driver of mobilization, radicalization in both of these communities. As long as that sectarian war continues to rage, it is going to be very, very difficult to defeat ISIS or Al-Qaeda or get Iranian-backed militias in the box or anything like that. And so that's one of the reasons why the notion of containment fails completely, because containment retains this escalating sectarian civil war, which has exactly the consequences that you described.
I could just jump in one other thing that we just have to remember, that we were, as you intimated, part of the last effort to foment an uprising against ISIL's predecessor, and we, as a result of the past experience where we promised them, if you fight with us and eventually the Iraqi government against Al-Qaeda, we'll look after you, and we didn't. So there's a problem with the credibility of the Iraqi government, and there's a problem with our credibility, which will make it much harder to replicate the past success. In addition, there's various other factors that kind of play into the mix now, that we just don't have a large presence on the ground the way we did in 2007 and after, in order to actually change the psychological dynamic in the way that we need to in order to get the people to rise up against an adversary, or right now the Islamic State, who is so vicious and cruel.
May I just add briefly? I think that it is important to recognize that Prime Minister Abadi has made more overtures to the Sunni community, certainly, than his predecessor did. And I think that there is room for, in Iraq, diplomatic outreach to try to support that and try to build links with the Shia majority, with the idea of helping to encourage them that ultimately their interests can be served by these non-military pathways to resolution. For example, really laying out a roadmap for the decentralization of Iraq, because I think that is ultimately the only way the country is going to hold together. I think also regionally, I'd like to note Saudi Arabia finally opened its embassy in Baghdad. That could provide a first step to build upon building relations between and contacts between Iraq and the Gulf states. But I think it's very important that a body do that outreach, because obviously the Gulf states are quite concerned about the reality of Iraq's closeness to Iran.
Very briefly, with the last few seconds that I have, the White House's new hostage policy. How do you think that ISIL will view that?
I don't think it's going to impact their decision-making very much at all, to be honest. I don't think they see that as their primary fundraising mechanism. Those people, as we know too well, are more valuable to ISIS as sort of propaganda tools than anything else.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Veazey. And as you cited a sectarian war and conflict, I had the opportunity this year to meet with a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, who explained to me that the sectarian war has been ongoing for 1,400 years. As we now proceed to Sheriff New.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think that's the biggest problem that you hit on, is that sectarian portion of it. But let's talk about the Kurds for a moment. They've had some great success. And you talked about, the arms that we're supplying the Iraqis that have to flow through the central government to the Kurds, and we saw that that was not actually working very well, but supposedly it's working better today. And I understand the reason for that, but aren't we sort of chasing our tail on this, because we think that we're going to build some rapport with the Kurds to the central government in Iraq, and they don't feel any allegiance to it. Just because you give them some weapons, do we really think that narrative is going to change the outcome as it relates to the Kurds and Iraqi state itself?
Congressman, I think that it's what would really change the dynamic is if we started treating Kurdistan as an independent state and sending weapons directly to Kurdistan. I think the notion, we're not binding them to Baghdad by sending weapons through Baghdad, but we would be making a positive statement that we're effectively treating them as independent if we started sending weapons directly to Kurdistan. And I think that we really need to be careful of overestimating what the Kurds' capabilities actually are. And geography is a problem here, because the Kurds are not going to clear Anbar. They're just not. And in point of fact, I actually believe that if you saw Kurdish forces push into Mosul and push into a lot of Nineveh province, you would start, and we're beginning to see little indicators of this, an ethnic war as the Arabs in those regions push back against what they would perceive to be Kurdish encroachment on their territory, and that would be overlaid on a sectarian war. So I think we really need to be careful. I'm all about helping the Kurds defend Kurdistan,
Right.
but I think we need to, I think we can do that, but I think we need to avoid, as some people are trying, seeing Kurds as the solution to this problem.
Yeah, I don't think they are either. The Deputy Secretary of State recently was spouting numbers, almost like in Vietnam, where 10,000 casualties, we've eliminated 6,000 pieces of equipment. What does that mean? I mean, is there any value in stating that? Because that's not an indicator of winning. That's just an indicator that we killed people and we demolished stuff.
Yeah, body counts are, as we know from our Vietnam experience, very deceiving and very dangerous. I will just say 2 points. First, it only matters if they have a finite manpower pool, and we need to know how are they able to replace the people being killed, or are they recruiting people faster than they're losing them? Well, I'll leave it at that. That's I think.
Well, let me ask you this, your opinion. Has ISIL been degraded since August of last year, since we started this campaign, or have they gotten stronger?
Well, yeah, let me just complete my thought on that one. Attrition matters to the degree that they're overextended, and further overextending them might make them vulnerable to internal uprisings or further attacks along the borders of the areas they control. So I think attrition is not irrelevant, but it's dangerous as a metric that's standalone. In terms of their capabilities, look, there have been areas they've been rolled back, and there are areas that they've pushed back successfully. So I think, and they've shown an ability to move their forces from Syria to Iraq and back again. So they've been attrited, but their capabilities remain overall relatively robust to the degree that they're able to maintain offensives and continue to gain ground in areas that are important for them. I don't think you could say that they've lost ground, except for Tikrit, which was, I think, important on a certain level symbolically, that they've lost ground in any areas that were critical for them. And they gained the provincial capital of Anbar, which is an important psychological gain for them. So, and Palmyra is too important, is in the context of Syria, it's very important.
I think one of the things to keep in mind about ISIS or ISIL is that to maintain function, to be a functional organization, it needs to stay on offense. It needs to have that message of fighting to get recruits, to keep people motivated. It's not going to do a good job hunkering down and defending a specific territory. And I think that you see that in some of the ways it's exposed itself. And I would argue that, you know, they're probably sitting around in a room saying, look, we've expanded in some places, we've lost in others. You know, does our geographic footprint need to fundamentally change? Did we try to take the right places? You know, where can we hunker down? Where can we actually be more secure? And I don't think they know that. My expectation is that they will be, the territory they control will contract by the end of 2015. It will still be a very viable organization and one that is extremely resilient going forward. But I expect they will contract more this year.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent. We now proceed to Mr. Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your assessment of the Kurds. Having fought with the Kurds, I don't think they're going to look at Mosul, primarily because you have about 500,000 refugees if they attempt it, and the refugees can't go north, they can't go south. The only way they could go is in Kurd-held territory. I don't think they want that or could afford that. I also agree with your assessment on Syria, and until we figure out what we're going to do with Syria, whether we're going to arm the Syrian Free Army or having the desert as an area of sanctuary to a degree with ISIS is problematic. But what I'm not hearing is Iran, Persia, and the influence in now eastern Iraq. Reports, I think, are validated that you have the Badr army now moving to what's, in my experience, was never more than about 7,000. The Shia militia seems to be operating at now 30 to 40,000 at full strength. Seems to be either closely coordinated or directly controlled by Iran. You have senior military leadership embedded. And so my question is, and this has been a change of sea for me, because I looked at Iraq and thought there are multiple opportunities for us to check ISIS. And we have passed many of those. And now if we enter and we cede territory from ISIS, and if the result is simply for a Shia militia, which is to a degree controlled by Iran, to now, if we're ceding territory from ISIS and simply having that territory being filled by Iran and their continuing influence in Iraq, then what's the point? Do you share a concern, Dr. Keegan, about Iran's seems to be expanding influence, particularly in eastern Iraq, and the effects it has with disenfranchising further the Sunni population?
Absolutely, and it's not just eastern Iraq. It's Baghdad, and it's Anbar, and it's throughout Iraq. I think that there's a lot of complexity among the Shia militias that we're seeing on the ground, and I think it's important not to lump them all together, not that you did. By the way, Badr just basically seized the governorship of Diyala province, which is going to be problematic from the standpoint of National Guard law, among many other things. But you have Badr and you have Kataib Hezbollah, which are basically arms of the Quds Force, in my assessment, and are basically commanded by Soleimani. You have Asib al-Haq, which is not quite there, but close. But then you have popular mobilization forces that actually responded to Grand Ayatollah Sistani's call, and I don't believe that all of those are controlled by BOT or KH or AAH, and I do believe that there is a possibility that those forces, some of those forces could be integrated into the ISF and could be, are less under the Iranian control. I think the issue is, if we assess, and I do agree with Linda Robinson that Prime Minister Abadi is much better than his predecessor, who was a major driver of sectarian conflict. And I think that the Prime Minister really actually has the right goals in mind.
We agree on that.
But I think he's being pushed hard by radical Shia militias and by Iranian advisors in a sectarian direction. And I think that it's very important that we offer him enough of an alternative and that we overcome or try to overcome the credibility gap that Mike Eisenstadt pointed out, to give him an opportunity to try to unwind these militias from control of his state, because he's not really sovereign in what he controls, as long as Soleimani is commanding armed forces in his territory.
And Ms. Robinson, I agree with much of your assessment as well. How do you see the Iranian influence being checked and pushed out of the territory of Iraq? I think that's a core issue, is that as you continue the Iranian influence, how is it that we're going to push them back across in Iranian territory rather than territory of Iraq? And is it possible?
Well, I'd like to start by quoting my esteemed friend, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who said, Iran is not going to leave the borders of Iraq. It's always going to be a neighbor of Iraq. So it's a long-term issue, and I don't think we can wave a wand and make Iran or Iranian influence go away. But I think the critical question for the U.S. is, are we going to cede Iraq to Iranian influence, or are we going to get in there and play the influence game? And I think that includes a much more robust outreach to a whole range of Shia forces. And I appreciate what Fred said, and also your comment. The Shia mosaic is quite complex. There are the long-standing Shia militias we've already mentioned, but also new splinter groups that are supposedly less anti-American. They might be more receptive to outreach. And then these volunteers that came forward because Ayatollah Sistani said, come and defend your country. And he, of course, is, I think, a main critical figure, so long as he is still alive, to try to find that path between Iranian dominance and Shia Iraqi nationalism, which is not dead but much mitigated. So I think it's a long-term project, but really we have to be, and it is a part of a political line of effort that I think we have to open up and encourage our diplomats to be part of. Again, citing my friend Brian Crocker, who was fully engaged in that. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zinke. Thank you for your service here, and thank you for your service as a Navy SEAL. We now proceed to the Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee, Trent Franks of Arizona.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. I have to suggest I'm going to try to probably piggyback off of a couple of comments that have already been made, starting with the Kurdish issue. Last week during the HASC hearing, I had questioned Secretary of Defense Carter on the administration's strategy on ISIS. And of course, you know, many of us know that even though that Dr. Kagan is correct about Kurdish not being able to do, they're certainly limited, but they have been a bright spot in this situation. And we did pass an amendment in the full committee here to give direct support to the Kurds for that reason alone. But after the Secretary himself responded in a steadfast agreement that the Kurds were making progress, then the State Department, the Defense Department, and U.S. Ambassador to Iraq have derailed Senator Joni Ernst's efforts to do the same on the Senate floor last week with a very intense lobbying effort. And to quote a senior administration official, this quote, this is, the U.S. gives weapons directly only to the Iraqi government and to the Iraqi security forces, but the lines between them and the militias are blurry. U.S. weapons often fall into the hands of militias like Iraqi Hezbollah. There's no real command and control from the central government, and that seems to underscore what I'm saying here. This bank shot that the administration tries to do using the Iraqi central government as the distribution mechanism doesn't seem to be working very well. Do you think, and Dr. Kagan, I'll ask for a quick answer because I'm hoping to get one more question in. Do you think that it's sound policy to just kind of hope for the best and hope some of the money will get to Kurds, or do you think that we need to be more direct in our effort to assist the Kurds and the Peshmerga in doing at least some of the good work that they're doing?
Sir, I don't think hope is ever a good method, but I think this goes beyond hope, and I think that as far as I've been able to hear and follow up on this, the Kurds are largely getting what they need, and I don't think it's a good idea to be providing support directly to Kurdistan.
Help me understand that. Why not?
Because when you provide direct support to Kurdistan, and I understand and sympathize with the motivations of the committee and members.
Because they're the only ones
that.
kicking ISIS rear.
Right, but they can only do that up to a point. And the problem is that by supporting the Kurds directly, you're making a statement unintentionally about Kurdish independence and the Kurdish role.
Well, I know we wouldn't want to hurt anybody's feelings here, but I guess I'm just concerned about that, you know, somebody's got to fight ISIS, and this administration is not doing that.
I can't disagree with that enough, but the Kurds are not going to be able to do it either. And so we're going to have to find partners in Arab Iraq, and that means that there's a limit to how much we can afford to side with the Kurds, and what is, after all,
who's a better partner than the Kurds right now?
Right now, the partner that we need is in the Sunni Arab community. That is the partner that we most need. And the problem is that the more that you support the Kurds in Nineveh and along the disputed areas, and the Kurds push into those areas, the more that we put ourselves against the Sunni Arab community that might otherwise join us in fighting ISIS. Now, we don't have a strategy that's going to get them to join us fighting ISIS right now, and we need to address that. But I'm afraid that the Kurdish arming the Kurds directly would be counterproductive.
Let me shift gears. I would just suggest to you that the Sunnis weren't fighting the ISIS very effectively before, where the Kurdish at least were trying. So we know that the deadline for the P5+1 nuclear negotiations with Iran is about a week away, and this administration seems hell-bent on doing a deal no matter what it is, and the only thing that seems to be possible to get in their way is the intransigence of the Tehran government themselves, that they can't, you know. So this concern midterm could have implications across the Middle East that, you know, it's hard to fathom right now. And what effects do you see happening of the injection into the Iranian economy of billions of dollars under such a potential agreement to sponsor additional terrorism in the region? Do you think that them getting a great deal more money is going to somehow make this all better?
The Iranian regime has been extremely clear that it has no intention whatsoever of altering any of its policies in the region or toward the United States, regardless of whether there is a deal. They regard us as an enemy, and they intend to continue to pursue efforts to drive us from the region and destroy our allies. If they receive a significant influx of additional resources, they will put it, among other things, to the purpose of increasing their military and paramilitary capabilities throughout the region and throughout the world.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Kagan. And I would just say, Mr. Chairman, that as dangerous as ISIS is, we need to fight them, but we cannot take our eye off of the Iranian nuclear threat. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Franks. And we now proceed to Mr. Lamborn of Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Thank you all for being here. And I'd like to ask you about our targeting of ISIS assets. The New York Times reported on May 26th that, quote, American officials say that they are not striking significant and obvious Islamic State targets out of fear that the attacks will accidentally kill civilians, but many Iraqi commanders and some American officers say that exercising such prudence with airstrikes is a major reason ISIS has been able to seize vast territory in recent months in Iraq and Syria. Dr. Kagan, would you agree with that assessment? And is it possible to step up airstrikes while still, to the degree possible, preserving civilian lives?
I think that there is a trade-off between deciding that you're going to have a more effective air campaign and accepting a higher risk of civilian casualties. I think if your standard for civilian casualties is low, you're probably going to have a very hard time increasing the intensity of the air campaign, especially as long as you're not prepared to put forward air controllers on the ground, which would be something that would mitigate that. But I think that we have too high a standard from the standpoint of collateral damage and civilian casualties. I think that the truth is this is a war, and we always try to minimize collateral damage and civilian casualties, but a standard of effectively zero has, I think, done enormous harm to our ability to prosecute this war with the tools that we have at our disposal.
Okay. Thank you. And then for any one of you, I'm really concerned about Jordan's welfare. They have the direct threat of ISIS wanting to overcome them, and they have the indirect threat of floods of refugees from Syria, especially, overwhelming their infrastructure and their budget. What can we do to better help Jordan? What should Jordan be doing to help itself?
I'm glad you raised that because I did include mention of Jordan in my written remarks, and I think it is critical. Jordan, of course, does have a very effective and efficient military, police, and intelligence service. But that said, I think the waves of refugees pose a long-term threat, not just a humanitarian issue, but to the political and economic fabric of that country, as well as the surrounding region. And I think that trying to get more involved with those refugee populations, possibly through international organizations, but to deepen the understanding of what is going on there and help to ensure that they don't become subject to concerted radicalization campaigns or support networks, and to eventually find a disposition for these people. I doubt they're going to go, most of them will go back home. So this poses a very critical long-term threat.
Just one thing to add to that. I absolutely agree that we shouldn't expect that they're going to go home, and we should plan that these are not just refugees, many of these people are going to be new citizens, essentially, of Jordan. But this is a place where many of our Arab allies, I think, also have a responsibility, and we should be leading politically to pull them along. It's a place where they can contribute, even if they're not going to contribute militarily. This is something where they can contribute, where money matters, and they can offer that.
And either Mr. Eisenstadt or Dr. Kagan, anything to add to that?
I think you're making an excellent point, and I am also very worried about Jordan and the strain that's being put on it. And I would just turn it in a slightly different way, because there are a lot of people in town who are talking about the need to raise an Arab army to fight in Syria and Iraq, and the Jordanians should fight, and the Saudis should fight, and so forth. And you've highlighted one of the reasons why that's not really feasible. The Jordanians, I would not be enthusiastic about calling on the Jordanians to deploy large numbers of their own forces abroad for a whole bunch of reasons.
And I'll just add, you can't worry too much about Jordan because of its importance vis-a-vis our allies, Saudi, Israel. But that said, keep in mind they've been dealing with the problem of refugees for well over a decade now, or actually even longer. And their resilience and their ability to do so is remarkable. But that said, we can't take them for granted. They are absolutely critical ally of ours. And we are doing things. They get financial aid, they get military assistance. I can't say whether we should be doing more or not, but I think we are focused on that issue.
Well, and you probably know in the NDAA, which is going to be going to conference, we just voted on with the Senate, I think we put in $300+ million of very good military aid for Jordan. So, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lambert. And we've been joined by Congresswoman Martha McSally of Arizona, the very first female air combat pilot to serve in Congress. Congresswoman McSally.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. I'm not on this committee, but I wanted to join. I appreciate the testimony and your perspectives. I know there's a lot of talk about specifically the strategy about ISIS, and I know you've, in the discussions on Iran, talked a little bit more about the regional dynamic. A big concern that I have is the incoherence of a strategy in the region, especially vis-a-vis Iran. The elephant in the room. We're focusing a lot on ISIS, which is important, but we're kind of looking through a soda straw without realizing some of the dynamics with our Sunni allies are related to the incoherence and the inconsistencies in how we're dealing with Iran. On the one hand, doing everything we can to get to a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, allowing them, Soleimani to be the ground force commander while we're providing the air forces in Tikrit, and vis-a-vis what we're doing in Yemen. I mean, it's totally incoherent. So I would like to get your perspectives on that incoherence and what we could be doing better regionally to address address not just ISIS, but also this largest state sponsor of terror on the globe, which is Iran. And then I want to follow up with some discussion on the air campaign.
Yeah, if I could just start off by saying, first of all, we'll never be able to iron out all the contradictions in our policies. There's just way too many moving pieces in this part of the world, and we'll never be able to square the circle. But that said, I would argue that just as during the Cold War, while negotiating arms control deals with the Soviet Union, we pushed back against Soviet aggression and proxy activities around the world, we should be doing more in that regard with Iran. I'm fully supportive of trying to put the relationship between the United States and Iran on more normal basis, while still acting to advance our interests and to defend the interests of our allies, which means doing more things in Syria with regard to the opposition there, doing things like we are doing to the credit of the administration with regard to interdicting arms shipments to the Houthis in Yemen, and do some of the things we're doing in Iraq. But we needed to have been a lot more forceful than we have, and some of the things that the spokespersons of the administration have stated in public have sent the wrong signal in terms of being acquiescing to what is seen in the region as Iran's attempt to establish a modern-day empire. So we need to. It's a matter of finessing or striking the right balance in our policy, and we've not hit the right balance. There's more we could do.
Great, Dr. Kagan, thoughts on that, or?
I really want to second what Mike said and also what Brian said earlier. Absolutely, one should talk to one's enemies. You can negotiate with your enemy. You don't have to surrender every other interest that you have while negotiating with your enemy. And we should be pushing back. And what Brian said earlier was really, really important. Right. We have to support opposition in Syria against Assad. Otherwise, we have no meaningful opposition in Syria to support.
Exactly. Thank you. Now turn into the military strategy against ISIS. I was critical last week to the Secretary of Defense and the chairman related to our air campaign. And I think we've got this false choice really narrative in the media. It's either an air campaign that seems to not be working, or it's hundreds of thousands of boots on the ground. And the reality is, it seems like we're stuck in a counterinsurgency mindset that we've been mired in over the last 14 years. And we're forgetting that we have vital national interests in stopping ISIS that are separate and distinct from Iraq's interests in the region and what we're trying to get them to do. And so I feel very frustrated that we're not using air power as an airman to the extent that we can use it, where we minimize civilian casualties, but we hit the targets that are legitimate in order to take out the command and control, the logistics, the leadership, everything it takes for ISIS to be able to be continuing to have the momentum. So it's very frustrating, and I've heard and read your testimony. I believe we need more intelligence, more JTACs. We need to be using air power in a stronger way. We need to raise the bar to save one civilian casualty, but then allow ISIS to murder thousands of people on the ground is absolutely contradictory. We've got to be able to gain the momentum and use air power, and I just want your perspectives on that.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I find it baffling that ISIS has been able to maneuver mechanized forces around this battlefield in airspace while we control the airspace.
Exactly.
We have an entire military designed to prevent people from doing that.
Exactly.
So we certainly can, and as you say, we certainly can do it with minimum casualties, and we can do it without putting 150,000 troops on the ground also, and we should do it.
Exactly. Thank you.
If I could just add, my understanding is that we've, until recently perhaps, had most of our ISR in Afghanistan to support the drawdown there. And now I guess, and if you look at the trend lines of ISR sorties in Iraq and Syria, they are trending up. Mm-hmm. So there is, I suspect there are some of assets are being now redeployed to the fight there to support it. But that said, probably need more, and we probably need to be more aggressive with our airstrikes. And as Fred and others have said, strike a different balance with regard to the trade-offs, with regard to our concern to collateral damage and the need to consistently be pushing ISIS back and show that momentum has changed.
And we can gain the space then, therefore, for the political solution. But if we're letting them get the momentum because we're not using our elements of military power that we have in the way that is best used, then we are surrendering.
But that's a critical point, because every day Sunnis are making life and death calculations about which side do they throw their support behind. And if they see that, if they believe that after rising up against ISIS, 6 months from now, ISIL will be back because of our fecklessness.
Exactly.
They're not going to do that, and therefore there needs to be a consistent perception of progress being made, and we can't afford to allow them to claw back ISIL to claw back territory that's been lost or that was not under their control.
Great, thank you. My time is long expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me join the committee hearing today.
And thank you, Ms. McSally, for your insight, and thank you for joining us today on the subcommittee. And I want to thank each of you. This has really been very helpful, and each one of you have had points that we need to be considered. And I do have one request of Dr. Kagan. 2 years ago, you provided an extraordinary map indicating the spread of Al-Qaeda and its affiliates across North Africa, Central Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia. And for the benefit of our subcommittee members, if you could provide, if you do have, and I hope you do, an update of that map. It was extraordinarily helpful as I was explaining to my constituents the threats that we're facing from that region. If there's no further, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Grab the picture for you as well. Oh, yeah, yeah.